Welcome, sleepy traveler. You've arrived at a quiet space made just for you. My name is Valarie, and I am here to guide you gently into rest, to help ease your mind, soften your body, and drift you toward a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. Whether your day was long or your thoughts feel a little too loud tonight, let this be your permission to slow down, to breathe, and to simply be. There's nothing more to do now. Just allow my voice to be your guide as we begin this gentle journey toward deep, nourishing rest. If you're new here, subscribe for sleep content like this, and like this video if you find it enjoyable. Let's begin. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose. Feel your chest rise gently as the air fills your lungs. Hold it for just a moment and then let it softly drift out through your mouth. As you exhale, imagine any tension leaving your body like a quiet wave fading into the sand. Allow your shoulders to drop a little lower, your jaw to loosen, and your eyes to rest softly closed. This is your time to let go. There is nowhere else you need to be and nothing else you need to do. You are safe here in this gentle space that belongs entirely to you. Let the outside world fade into a soft blur, as if it's gently dimming like a sunset at the edge of your awareness. Every sound around you simply becomes part of your calm. Even the faintest noises can feel like distant waves, rolling in and out without asking for any attention. Bring your awareness to the crown of your head. Imagine a soft, warm glow there, like the first touch of morning light. This light begins to travel downward, slowly and tenderly, as if it's brushing you with a feeling of safety and warmth. It moves to your forehead, smoothing away any furrows or thoughts that have been lingering. Notice how your mind begins to feel just a little lighter, as if each thought is a feather floating away. Your eyes relax more deeply now, sinking into rest as the glow continues downward. Feel it move through your cheeks, releasing the tiny muscles that hold so much of the day. Your lips soften, your tongue rests gently in your mouth. A wave of stillness begins to hum softly in your body, a whisper that says, "You are safe, you can rest." This warmth glides down to your neck and shoulders now. They may have carried the weight of your thoughts today, but right now they are free to let go. With every exhale, imagine your shoulders sinking into a cloud, completely supported and without effort. Now the gentle glow flows down your arms, past your elbows, down into your forearms and wrists. Your hands relax fully, each finger releasing, softening, melting into the surface beneath them. Your arms feel so heavy and yet so light at the same time, as if they are floating in a warm, invisible river. The warmth returns to your chest. Feel the rise and fall of your breathing. Like a quiet lullaby, your body is singing to itself. Each breath in brings softness. Each breath out releases the remnants of the day. Notice your heart, steady and calm like a soft drumbeat in the distance. It doesn't ask for attention, but it reminds you gently that you are here and you are okay. This soft light now moves to your stomach and lower back. So much emotion can linger here without us realizing. Imagine the light moving through this space, smoothing, loosening, softening. With each breath out, it's as if little knots inside you are dissolving into calm. The light continues to flow down your hips, into your legs. Your thighs grow heavy and warm. Your knees release, your calves melt. Feel it reaching your ankles and finally your feet, softening each tiny muscle, each little toe. From the crown of your head to the tips of your toes, you are now bathed in a cocoon of warmth and serenity. Your entire body has become a quiet vessel for rest. Let your mind drift now, like a small boat rocking on a calm lake. The water is smooth and the air is cool and gentle. With each breath, you feel yourself floating a little farther from the shore of your thoughts. There is nothing to chase, nothing to fix. Only this moment, this softness, this peace. If a thought appears, see it as a cloud passing through your sky. You don't need to hold on to it. You can simply watch it drift and disappear into the horizon of your mind. Every pause, every slow breath is a gift to yourself. The gift of stillness, the gift of release, and the gift of deep, nourishing rest. Feel how your body is now part of the space around you, almost as if you are melting into the surface beneath you, becoming one with it. Safe, supported, and completely at ease. The world has slowed to a tender whisper, and all that remains is you and this gentle rhythm. A rhythm that guides you deeper into the quiet night within. Each breath carries you further along a soft path toward dreams. Imagine that path now. Perhaps it is lined with glowing lanterns, lighting the way without ever rushing you. You take a slow step and another, and with each step you feel lighter, as if the weight of the day is falling behind you. The air is cool but comforting. It smells of night flowers and the soft memory of rain. You walk until you find a small, cozy resting place. A gentle hammock sways between two trees, or perhaps a soft bed of moss waits just for you. You settle into this place, and the earth beneath you seems to hum a lullaby you've always known. Feel yourself being cradled by the night. Your breath is now slow and effortless. Your body is weightless, floating in warmth and peace. If sleep hasn't already begun to arrive, it is waiting just at the edge, ready to guide you gently. Let yourself drift there as softly as a feather falling on quiet water. You have arrived at the threshold of rest. Here, nothing can disturb you. Here, your dreams are safe and tender. You can let go fully, completely, knowing that the night holds you in kindness. Let the final threads of wakefulness unravel now. You are ready to drift into the soothing world of sleep. Your body, mind, and spirit have all been given permission to rest. Good night. Sleep well, and enjoy tonight's bedtime story. I didn't move here to make enemies. I moved here for the sound of leaves I wouldn't have to explain to anyone, for the quiet of a street where the mail truck is the only daily drama, and for the kind of twilight that finds the edges of things and makes them look almost forgiven. And yet, on my third morning in this small suburban neighborhood, I found myself toe-to-toe with a frown so powerful it could have written a strongly worded letter all by itself. Mr. Grant stood on his side of the fence with his palm flattened to the top rail like a sheriff sizing up the moral fiber of a town. He had silver hair cut neatly to the line of his collar, and a clean, craggy face that might have been handsome if it weren't for the permanent expression of someone who believes the world has slumped on his watch. A retired history teacher, I'd been told by the friendly baker at the corner cafe, a fact he wore like a scout badge and a warning label. He had already introduced himself to me by returning my trash bins to the precise boundary of my driveway, then informing me the wind chime on my back porch sounded like a haunted teapot. "It's the leaves again," he said now, chin pointy as an arrow. He gestured toward his lawn where a scatter of amber and bronze had drifted overnight like coins tossed on water. "From your maple." "They're from all the maples," I said, trying to keep lightness in my voice. "There's a row of them up the block." "And yet," he cut in, "they choose to congregate here, as if your yard were a staging ground." "I'll rake them up," I offered. "After lunch?" He gave me a tight nod, as if reluctant to accept aid from the enemy. "It would be appreciated." "And the wind chime—" "I like," I said. "It's gentle. It's squeaky." I could have told him I was a freelance illustrator, the kind of person who spent an unreasonable portion of life noticing small sounds. Pencil on paper, ink warming in the sun, the soft tick of a paint tube cap. I could have told him I moved here because my apartment above the laundromat in the city no longer felt like mine, because sleep was a timid animal that had stopped approaching me, because my work had turned flat and my heart lonelier than I wanted to tell anyone. But the only thing I said was, "I'll oil the chime." He peered over the fence, eyes narrowing at the way it leaned, weathered and slumped, like a tired older man at a bus stop. "That fence is on the property line," he said. "A shared responsibility." "I've only been here a week," I said, shifting the rake I'd been pretending to use. My grand plan was to introduce myself with cookies, but apparently we're beginning with a symposium on fences. "I don't eat cookies," he said. "Sugar, the devil's glitter." I was both amused and offended on behalf of butter. "Noted!" He gave the fence one last managerial glance. "It leans to my side." "It leans toward the truth," I said, instantly regretting the joke. Humor has a way of finding the wrong exit in moments like that. He didn't smile. "Please attend to your share, miss." "Holly," I said. "Miss Holly," he said, somehow making my first name sound like detention. After he retreated, I raked his leaves as promised, tossing them into compost bags with a determination I usually reserved for deadlines. It wasn't that I begrudged the raking. I liked the work, the scratchy rhythm of straw on lawn, the small pile becoming a bigger pile, the unambiguous success of it. What I disliked was the way I felt inside my own skin. A good student auditioning for a gold star. I had spent years escaping that feeling. In the afternoon, I set up my sketch pad at the patio table and tried to draw. I'd left behind the clamor of the city to give myself a new curve in the road, a different horizon. I wanted to illustrate children's books about birds who store songs in their pockets, or women who carry tiny lanterns inside their chests. But the page stared back blankly, and even my pencil seemed stiff with self-consciousness. Every time I found a line I liked, the chime made a small, sweet, guilty sound, like a throat clearing, reminding me of the man next door and his lawn that resented my trees. Late afternoon sloped toward evening. I boiled pasta. I ate standing up. I watched the light move down the maple trunks as if the day were carefully painting its way out. There's a relief sometimes in admitting that what you came for and what you found are different doorways to the same hallway. Stillness here did not mean ease. Stillness here meant listening harder to the parts of myself that had grown noisy with ignoring. At dusk, I stepped into the yard. A breeze lifted the wind chime, a cluster of small shells and tiny brushed metal rods I'd found at a flea market in June, and the sound rose, thin and tentative, then steadied the way your voice steadies when you remember who you are. I oiled the joint as promised. The squeak softened into a whisper, a hush that felt like a hand on a shoulder. That's when I noticed the loose board. It was third from the end, near the compost bin. It had separated from the post, nails grown tired with the season's push and pull. The fence leaned around it like a sentence trying to remember a word. I touched the wood. It was rough, splintery, sun-bleached to the color of old oats. If I pressed lightly, the board lifted, then slumped again. A small thing, fixable. I could have texted the number on the magnet stuck to my fridge. My real estate agent, perennially cheerful and always mentioning handy neighbors. I could have knocked on Mr. Grant's door and suggested we schedule a repair, split the bill, produce receipts, involve spreadsheets, and have a mature dialogue about property lines. But a stubborn part of me, that adolescent still inside me who never got to slam a bedroom door, whispered no. I wanted to do it myself, not to impress him, not even to appease him. I wanted to lay claim to this corner of my life with my own two hands, even if those hands were more used to watercolor than wood. Well, I said out loud to the fence, because I had become a woman who discussed projects with lumber. I guess I'll fix it myself. The moon lifted like a pale coin above the roofs. Somewhere a dog yawned a bark. I went inside, found my toolkit, an optimistic housewarming gift from my mother, and inventoried. Hammer, check. Nails, the fat kind, check. A little level with a bubble that looked like a trapped spirit, check. A paintbrush with stiff bristles. A half-empty can of something the color of wet stone. A roll of painter's tape. The only thing I didn't have was permission, and no one was going to hand that to me in a neat list. I worked in silence except for the occasional murmur of the chime. I eased the board off so the nails didn't scream. I sanded the roughness where the wood had split, the sound a rasping lullaby that soothed me more than I liked to admit. Under the splinters the board had good grain. It had held through winters and summers, through the force of snow and the green insistence of weeds. It would hold again. I measured twice, which would have made my father laugh. He was a measure once and dare the consequences kind of man. But I wanted this to be right. I braced the board, drove the nails carefully so they went true. Each hammer strike rang in the air, and I flinched more from the thought of disturbing anyone than from the noise itself. I kept going. The board settled in with a satisfying snugness, as if returning to a familiar story. The paint was an impulse. The fence's gray tired me. It was a shrug of color, a non-committal murk that made the flowers look bashful. I had a half-gallon of soft sage I'd bought for a bookshelf and never used, and the idea arrived the way certain lines arrive when I'm drawing. A sudden yes that hums from palms to ribs. It wouldn't be an overhaul, just one board. A gesture, an act of quiet caretaking. I stirred the paint and the smell rose, clean and slightly chemical, the scent of makeovers and nursery walls and middle-of-the-night decisions you're only brave enough to make in the dark. I taped the edges. I brushed on the first coat. Sage slid over wood like cool water. Instantly softer, instantly gentler. The board looked calmer, like someone had spoken to it kindly. I painted the nail heads. I painted the rim where the board met the post, careful not to stray onto the weathered gray, so that tomorrow, if Mr. Grant noticed, he could scold me for neatness instead of trespass. Every stroke steadied me. I thought of all the times in the city I had wished to be less visible, less studied, less measured for worth. Here, in my small yard, I was visible to exactly one cranky retired teacher, and whatever moths had decided my porch light meant open bar. Here I could lay down a color and not ask permission. I could choose a shade that sounded like a whisper in a library. You're allowed to be soft. When I'd finished, I rinsed the brush with the garden hose, mouth tasting like night air, pulse slow in a way it hadn't been in months. I stood and admired my single square of calm. My handprint, if hands could be watercolor. The moon had climbed higher, and the paint gathered a ghost of shine, as if the board had leaned toward the light to see itself better. I pressed my palm flat to the new color. "Hello," I said. I have a habit of greeting finished drawings, as if they were shy animals coaxed into the open. It felt right to greet this too. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Inside, I washed my hands and made tea. I checked my email. A small publisher I loved had written back. Could we see a few more character sketches? Maybe a layout? My scalp prickled with cautious hope. I went to the kitchen table and began to draw again, the way I used to before worry turned everything into a checklist. A small girl with a leaf in her hair. A bird whose shadow was shaped like a key. A fence that divided a page and then, in the next drawing, opened like parentheses. Sleep came easier. I woke before my alarm, something I hadn't done in years, and wandered barefoot to the back door with my mug cupped in both hands. Dawn was pale blue and polite. My board, my sage board, stood there like a friendly sentence, a small correction to a sloppy paragraph. I smiled without meaning to. Then I saw him. Mr. Grant was in his yard, pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt, hose in one hand like a ceremonial staff. He was staring at the fence, at my board. He tilted his head. He did not look outraged. He looked, to my surprise, baffled. This softened him, somehow. Confusion sits tenderly on even the sternest faces. I didn't move. I felt ridiculous for hiding behind a curtain in my own kitchen, but there I was. Half spy, half teenager, hoping to get away with something beautiful. He stepped closer, bent, and ran his fingers along the edge of the painted board like a man reading Braille. He looked at his fingertips, at the faint smear of green. He looked up at my kitchen window. I ducked too late. Our eyes met, the curtain a silly, insufficient veil. His eyebrows rose. I thought he'd bark something like, "Defacing a shared property, are we?" But he only mouthed, very clearly, the word, "Why?" Why had I done it? Because I wanted the fence to feel like less of a line and more of a seam. Because I am haunted by sagging things. Because I believe in the small dignity of repair. Because soft sage is the color you paint onto a thing when you want it to remember it was loved. None of that would travel well shouted across grass. I set my mug down. I stepped outside. The morning air lifted the hair at my temples. "It was loose," I said, gesturing toward the board like a magician revealing a single coin. "I fixed it, and then I trailed off, suddenly embarrassed by the paint, as if I'd drawn a mustache on a statue. He considered the board again. The wind chime found a small, well-oiled breath. A robin hopped along the fence top, approved, and flew away. "It's green," he said. "Sage," I said, because accuracy is a mercy. Soft sage. It's not the agreed-upon color, he said, and for a moment I imagined there had once been a town meeting where fence colors were voted on by raised hands and stern nods. Then something almost like amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth. But it is handsome. Handsome. I tried not to laugh with relief. Thank you. You understand, he went on, that one board painted that color makes the rest look shabby. I do, I said. Maybe shabby is honest. Or maybe shabby is an invitation, he said, gaze drifting down the fence line. I wanted him to ask if I would paint the rest. I wanted him to say he had a brush, too. I wanted him to admit he didn't mind the chime when it sounded like a whisper. Instead, he tightened the nozzle on the hose and watered his hydrangeas with the seriousness of a man irrigating empire. Leaves, he said after a moment, like a man remembering his lines. The leaves blew again in the night. I'll rake them, I said. I took a breath. Maybe later we could talk about the fence, together, if you want. He looked down at his slippers as if consulting them. We will see. It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was the kind of answer older men give when they've been disappointed by too many people and decide to dispense hope in teaspoons. He turned off the hose. He looked again at the painted board. His face did something I couldn't name, a passing weather. My wife would have liked that color, he said, almost to himself. She had a sweater, something like it. He cleared his throat. Thank you for fixing it. By the time I could think what to say, do you miss her? Would you tell me about her? He had gone inside. The back door shut gently as if the house were practicing good manners. I spent the morning sketching by the fence, my back warm with sun. The chime breathed the occasional silver syllable into the air, less a sound than a feeling. I drew a story next to it about a girl who moved to a quiet street and found a gap in the fence that wasn't a mistake but an invitation. She patched it with color, and in doing so discovered the plank of herself that had been waiting for a stroke of paint. At noon I raked the leaves again, this time with less resentment and more rhythm. A boy on a skateboard rattled past and raised a hand in a wave. The mail truck stopped with its ceremonial sigh, and a woman with a braid handed me a small package containing ink I didn't need but had wanted, an act of faith I'd ordered the night I couldn't sleep. I ate an apple in the sun and thought about buying more sage paint. Thought about writing it on a list with bread and dish soap and courage. In the late afternoon, the sky softened to the color of my board, as if the day were nodding to it in approval. I decided to take one more step I wouldn't have taken last week. I drew a small bird on a scrap of watercolor paper, quick and bright. I painted its belly a blush of peach and dusted its back with the faintest suggestion of sage. Underneath I lettered neatly, for your wife's sweater, or for any other reason you like. Holly. I slipped it into an envelope, walked to Mr. Grant's front door, and left it on the mat beside the potted fern that looked like it had been coached to stand up straight. I didn't ring the bell. I am braver in brush strokes than in bell chimes. I retreated to my yard and pretended to be fascinated by clover. Time passed, the quiet, heroic minute, then the next. I nearly forgot about the envelope when the gate creaked and he appeared. He didn't look at me, not directly. He looked instead at the fence as if it were a chalkboard upon which he had assigned an impossible problem. He held the envelope in his hand. "Miss Holly," he said, and there was a crack in his voice as thin as a hairline fracture in porcelain. He cleared his throat. "Thank you." "You're welcome," I said. And because he seemed to need permission, I added, "You can call me Holly." "Holly," he repeated, trying on the first name world like a suit jacket he wasn't sure fit. He glanced at the board again. "Sage," he said. "I remember now. My wife used to keep a little herb garden in a window box. She'd rub the leaves between her fingers and say, 'Smell this, Arthur. It's like a soft answer.'" The name, Arthur, surprised me as if I had discovered his first name carved into an old desk. I could have said I was sorry for his loss, but the words felt threadbare, true and insufficient. Instead, I said the only thing that rose naturally. "It is a soft answer." We stood there in the easy awkwardness of people halfway across their own fences. He looked at the sky, then at the board, then back at the sky. "I have paint in the basement," he said. "Not that color, but brushes. And I could, if you, perhaps tomorrow we might attend to the next two." "Tomorrow," I said, and the word felt like a decent promise. "I have more of this color." He nodded once, decisively, as if having issued an edict. "Very well, tomorrow." That evening I made pasta again, but sat down to eat with a cloth napkin and a glass of the decent wine my sister had given me when I moved. I listened to the wind chime and felt the neighborhood breathing, dogs with their last walk, a kid practicing trumpet in the next block, a screen door slap somewhere to the east. I thought of all the fences in the world that divided what could have been shared, and I wanted to paint them all soft sage and see what happened. I settled for a thank you text to my mother for the toolbox, and a sketch of a man and a woman in a kitchen, smelling sage leaves, smiling at something ordinary and holy. Before bed, I stepped into the yard. The board had dried to a graceful mat. A moth tapped it like a guest. I touched the wood, not to test it, but to say good night. Across the fence, I saw the faint square of Mr. Grant's kitchen window, lit and then darkened, as if a curtain had been drawn and then reopened. For a moment I imagined the envelope on his table, the little bird with its blush belly, and the way he might be holding it carefully, the way people hold fragile proof that they haven't been forgotten. I didn't move here to make enemies. I moved here to listen. And sometimes listening requires you to say the first soft thing out loud, to lay down the first compliment of color, to fix the thing leaning between you and your neighbor without making a speech about being right. When I finally turned back toward the house, the wind chime brushed the air, small and silver and no longer squeaky, like the opening of a polite conversation carried toward tomorrow. 3 mornings after the Sage Board Summit, as I titled it in my sketchbook, in a curly banner above a drawing of 2 suspiciously similar silhouettes holding identical paintbrushes, I opened my back door with coffee and a plan to procrastinate. The plan involved staring at clouds and telling myself they were reference studies. I got as far as cirrus when my eyes slid to the base of the fence near the compost bin and then refused to slide back. There, where bare earth gave way to the narrow strip of pebbles, sat 3 small terracotta pots in a straight soldierly row. The soil was mounded neatly in each. In the middle pot, bursting like a love note someone finally decided to send, bloomed a marigold, the exact color of persimmon jam. In the left pot, a marigold with a freckled face tilted toward my side. In the right pot, a smaller bloom had just begun to open, its petals still cupped in on themselves like hands at prayer. I stood barefoot on the cool kitchen tile, coffee unsipped, and considered the geometry of aftermath. The pots were clearly on my side of the fence, but the line of disturbed pebbles and the faint scrape marks at the base made the origin obvious. Placed through from the slat gap, slid like contraband kindness. No card, no note, no lecture about leaves, just orange joy planted like a flag. Arthur, I whispered, and the name felt less like trespass and more like a secret handshake with the morning. I should have let the coffee conspire with me, but my hands were already moving. I put the mug down and crouched to inspect. The pots were old but clean, each with a dusting of lime along the rim, the signature of basement shelves where time wears a chalk mustache. Someone had watered them recently. The soil was dark and cool. A tiny wooden stick labeled Marigold in tidy block letters was tucked into the middle pot, as if the flowers might forget themselves and need reminding later. I caught a glimpse of motion through the slat. Reflexively, I straightened and smoothed my hair, which was ridiculous, given that my hair had decided long ago it would choose its own weather and did not accept coaching. A shadow moved in the neighbor yard. A watering can tipped. The soft hush of water met leaves. And then the gate creaked open, not mine, his. And Mr. Grant, in a neat denim shirt and the kind of sun hat that looks like an apology to dermatologists, stepped into view. We saw each other at the same time and both did the thing proud citizens of Awkwardland do. pretended to be surprised. He glanced at the marigolds and then at me and squared his shoulders. "Miss Holly," he said, as if calling roll. Today his voice was less gravel, more gravel with a few wildflower seeds in it. "You seem to have acquired ornamentation." "Apparently they migrate," I said, trying for flat. "Like your leaves." His mouth almost smiled, then decided it had forgotten how. We performed the neighborly ritual of non-acknowledgement in silence for a beat. He adjusted the strap of his watch. I tucked a stray curl behind my ear. A traveling robin stopped on the fence rail, as if to judge a contest we hadn't admitted we were in. "They look sturdy," I said, caving first. "Marigolds always do, like small suns with spines." "They are pest-resistant," he said, which is not a phrase that would have occurred to me in 1,000 years, but which I loved instantly for how obviously he meant I thought ahead. I had extra seedlings, overzealous sowing. "Thank you," I said, and the words felt oddly formal, as if I were thanking a librarian for extending my borrowing privileges to include an entire summer. He made a noise like a concession in a debate. "Well, a fence benefits from color." We both looked at the sage board, which had dried into a soft square of calm. The rest of the fence still leaned in places, but now the whole line seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what these two ridiculous people would do next. "I might put them along in a line," I said, gesturing to the marigolds, "if that's all right." He pushed his glasses up with one finger. "Soldiers out of formation," he said thoughtfully. "It pains me, but I will endure." We did not discuss the obvious. We did not speak of pushing the pots under the slat, of early morning footsteps, of secret delivery. Instead, we each resumed our assigned positions in the national park of this street. Him, the caretaker; me, the observer; the fence, the interpretive sign between. When he went inside, careful not to look like he cared whether or not I liked the flowers, I knelt. I placed the pots in a parade along the base of the fence, 3 little suns rising. I brushed my fingers over the leaves and thought of my dad teaching me, in our old backyard, which plants liked to be touched and which preferred to be left alone. Marigolds were talkers. "Rub their leaves," he'd said, "and they'll tell you what the earth tastes like today." I rubbed a leaf. It told me pepper, dust, and someone else's memory. I watered the pots. I painted a quick sketch of them in my notebook. 3 tidy terracotta cylinders labeled counter-move. I added a little speech bubble to one. "Nice color, kid." Then I taped the page over my desk for later. Clients were waiting on layouts. A deadline was peering around the corner like a nosy neighbor. I told the deadline to wait in the car with the windows down and return to my main occupation, which was pretending not to be delighted. That afternoon, because I am both incorrigible and sentimental, I decided on my own small reply. I went inside and rummaged through the drawer where useful things go to lose themselves. Rubber bands, stray screws, take-out chopsticks, orphan keys to metaphorical doors. I found what I wanted, a tiny metal bird feeder I'd bought at a yard sale, a little dome with a tray and a hook. It was comically small, meant for chickadees, or perhaps the idea of chickadees. I filled the tray with seed, hung it on my side of the fence on a nail just above the sage board, and stepped back. It looked like punctuation, a comma with ambition. By 5 o'clock there were actual chickadees. A pair of them, disguised as punctuation themselves, hyphens with wings, landed, took a few seeds, and zipped to the lilac bush with the frantic joy of thieves in a cartoon. I clapped, alone in my yard like an audience of one at a very specific show. My wind chime murmured approval, no squeak, just a small silvering. Yes. Around 7, I heard a sound that was not familiar but not unpleasant. Not the bright ding of my own chime, not the leaf mutter. It was more of a hum, as if a bottle had learned to sing or a breeze had found a new vowel. I followed it to the fence. Through the slat, I caught a new line of shine under the eaves of Mr. Grant's back porch. A neat row of wind chimes, slender tubes of brushed aluminum, hung at precise intervals. He gave each one a tiny tap with the back of his fingernail, as if to test a lesson plan. The porch glowed with late sunlight like a stage set for a ballet of breezes. I almost called out, but then I saw him pause and tilt his head, listening with the intensity of someone trying to remember a name, and it seemed wrong to interrupt him with mine. So it began, the silent game. In public, we kept our brow furrows polished. In daylight, our nods were curt as coat checks. But at sunrise or after sundown, after the evening news had scolded the world, we crept to the border like two smugglers of kindness, ferrying contraband joy over the posts and slats. I started waking earlier, something I had not done willingly since I was 22 and believed breakfast was a personality trait. I'd tiptoe into the yard with a jacket over pajamas and a handful of seed, fill the tiny feeder and whisper sternly at squirrels who eyed it like mobsters casing a jewelry store. Sometimes I tucked a small paper crane into the fencing, wedging it where the slat met the post, a white triangle with a secret folded into its wings. Each crane had a word on its belly in my neat illustrator script: patience, pepper, listen, stay. On his side, evidence bloomed. Overnight a narrow trellis appeared, the kind with a fine grid like graph paper, leaned against the fence in the corner where the slats met his tool shed. I discovered it because, at dawn, my coffee caught a shadow in the shape of ambition. 2 days later, nubby green fingers reached up from the soil on my side. A climbing vine I had not planted. its tendrils already curling around the bottom rung of the trellis in a system far older than any boundary survey. A small stake with a label appeared through the slat gap. Morning Glory, in that same tidy block lettering, the G careful as a school teacher demonstrating how to write a capital that meant business. I bought string lights that looked like tiny paper lanterns and draped them along my section, only turning them on when the sky lost its color and my courage found enough. He added a second row of chimes, these shorter, tuned higher, like laughter layered over a conversation. We met by accident at the fence on one of those evenings, both armed with the tools of sneaky kindness, me with a spool of twine and a handful of hooks, him with a small hammer and a level. We froze, as if the porch light were a searchlight and we were caught. "A level," I said approvingly. "Of course. A spool of twine," he countered. "Dangerous material." We stood like rivals in an old black and white film, glancing at our props, our mouths pulling against smiles like kites against strings. "I suppose it's only fair to confess," I said. "The bird feeder is mine." "And the marigolds," he said, as if he were clarifying a footnote, "are entirely coincidental." I tilted my head. "Coincidental marigolds?" "There were extra," he said primly. "Of course." "Also," he added, adjusting the smallest chime by half an inch, "they deter certain insects." "Pests," I said, unable to resist. He glanced at me, and for a second, one of those seconds that changes what the next ones look like, his face did the softening thing again. "Not you," he said. "Not any more." It would have been reasonable to make a joke then. I did not. I only nodded, feeling something warm and embarrassed run up my neck like a sunrise trying to schedule itself. We resumed our tending as if we had not said anything at all. By the end of the week, the fence had started performing a magic trick. What had been gray and leaning was now shockingly busy with small insistences. Morning glory vines tugged at gritted wood and began their careful climb. The marigolds flared. The sageboard, my sageboard, stood like a flag that had inspired activism. Little wild violets I'd never noticed took up residence at the posts, as if attracted by the new sense of purpose. Here and there, paint joined the plot. Another soft sage square 2 sections down, a slender border of cream along a top rail, the faintest blush of blue where a knothole had been patched on his side. In the daytimes, the street still saw 2 responsible adults with functional boundaries and opinions about leaf blowers. When I ran into him at the mailbox, he would nod so faintly it could have been a spasm. When he saw me at the corner cafe, he would lift his paper cup in an almost toast that could have been addressed to the weather. Once in the grocery store, we both reached for the same bunch of parsley at the same time and withdrew with the synchronized efficiency of diplomats avoiding eye contact. The cashier asked me if I wanted paper or plastic, and I said, sage, which she did not find amusing. Nights were different. Nights I watched moths commute along the string lights, pausing at each bulb like a friend at a series of stoops. Nights he tested the chimes with the back of his knuckle and listened to the notes bloom and overlap, the sound making a kind of map only he could read. I began to assign the chime notes names in my mind. The lowest, history book closed. The middle, tea poured into the quiet. The highest, marigold laughter. Once around midnight I heard his radio low through an open window, playing a symphony at the same volume one might hear a kettle confessing regrets. He turned it down further, as if remembering he didn't want the neighborhood to know he enjoyed anything. One morning before sunrise I found, hanging from a nail that had not existed the day before, a small tin tag with my name stamped into it. Holly, each letter as squared and careful as if submitted for a grade. It was fixed above the sage board, the metal catching the early light like a modest badge. I touched the letters and felt a pinch behind my eyes I would have blamed on the cool air if anyone had asked. Later that same day, because I cannot let a gesture win without a reply, I made him a tag too. I didn't have stamping tools, but I had a thin rectangle of balsa wood and a brand new pen, the ink deep and patient. I wrote his name in my neatest hand, Arthur, and burned the edges carefully with a match until they curled like old paper. I hung it from the nail on his side of the fence in the early dusk, heart bashing my ribs with teenage enthusiasm. The next morning it had been moved an inch to the left, no note, no comment, aligned precisely with the center of the sage board as if it had been admitted, then organized. The comedic part of all this, if you could call it that, unfolded in the theater of our front yards. Neighbors, emboldened by the safety of sidewalks, began commenting on the fence that was definitely, without question, looking different. Mrs. Luo from 2 houses down walked past with her fluffy dog and peered at the vines over the top. "You two competing?" she asked. "I vote for whoever grows a gourd first." "Competing?" I said, the picture of indifference. "About what?" She arched an eyebrow. "Mm-hmm." The teenager on a skateboard rolled by slow enough to say, "Sick chimes," and I pretended not to know which yard he was addressing, because the answer was yes. One afternoon, I was trudging in with groceries when I met Mr. Grant at the curb, both of us trapped in the narrow theater of a shared sidewalk. He had a bag from the hardware store. I had a baguette that refused to behave like a normal bread product and instead acted like an unruly wand. We assessed each other's props. He nodded to my baguette. "Blunt instrument?" "For smashing pests," I said. "Ah," he said. "Good." We passed like ships exchanging dignified honks. The marigolds back at the fence laughed in orange. We managed this absurd seriousness for days, and then the fence did the thing fences do when you love them. It started to show off. Morning glories unfurled periwinkle trumpets in the first breath of sun and shut them politely by afternoon. A schedule no one had emailed me, but which my body began to anticipate. The humming of the chimes found a confidence that made me want to write with a thicker brush. The feeder brought a downy woodpecker who tapped politely at the rail as if to see if the sage paint tasted like leaves. On my desk, the drawings changed. The line relaxed, as if it had finally received permission to be a person and not a performance. I submitted my layouts to the publisher, 2 pages of a story called The Fence Between Us, although I knew I'd have to rename it or pretend it was about rabbits wearing hats. They wrote back with questions and enthusiasm, which is the exact mix that keeps an illustrator up until midnight, happily moving a bird from one branch to another. I found myself sketching men with careful handwriting and neat porches and something like grief pressed into their collar seams. I drew women who planted marigolds against their better judgment. I drew fences not as divisions, but as long shared shelves upon which neighbors place their favorite small things. The only truly public crack in our serious masks came courtesy of the wind. It was one of those hard, showy gusts that likes to make a meal of trash day. My feeder swung in frantic arcs. The chimes turned into a chorus. The morning glory leaves pressed themselves like green hands against the fence and then sprung back. I was outside, wrestling a rolling bin to the curb when Mr. Grant emerged like a captain refusing to abandon ship. The wind took his sun hat. It scooted across the grass toward my yard like a guilty turtle. We both chased it with the exact dignity of people who had promised themselves they would not run in public. The hat hit the edge of the fence, hesitated, and then performed a graceful flop into my lilac bush, where it landed brim up like a nest for invisible eggs. I reached in and extracted it, leaves raining down my sleeves. Mr. Grant reached the fence a second after. We stood nose to slats, me with the hat, him with the kind of wild-eyed look people get when they have nearly lost their favorite small thing. "Caught it," I said, breathless and ridiculous, holding up the sun hat as if it were evidence in a trial about humility. He exhaled. Good heavens. I passed the hat over the fence. He took it carefully. "Much obliged," he said, and then he added in a tone that suggested he had to grab the additional words before they flew away. I would have been annoyed. "I can't imagine," I said, solemn as a judge. The wind settled in the way it does when it decides you got the point. The chimes returned to humming. The morning glories peeled their leaves away from the slats, as if reassured that their page would not be torn from the book. That night, I found a new pot on my side, smaller than the marigolds, with a label that read "Sweet Pea." I laughed out loud for the pure pleasure of a person who has been offered their favorite thing without having to ask for it. I tucked the pot under the trellis. The next morning I found a coil of twine hanging on a nail on his side, a silent request and response. Tie the new shoots, give them something to hold. I did, gently, the way my mother had taught me to tie a bowline knot when she was feeling nautical. The vine accepted my guidance like a dancer accepting a hand, and by week's end, little tendrils were investigating higher rungs with the curiosity of climbers who have heard rumors of a better view. One evening, as I was tying, a voice came soft through the slats. My wife used to grow sweet peas. I froze, not because I did not want to hear, but because there are certain sentences that feel like you should take off your hat for them. I put the twine down. They're my favorite, I said, quiet as a porch light. Mine as well, he said, and there was a small smile in his voice, the kind you can only hear when you're close to a fence. She said they made the air softer. They do, I said. They will. We didn't say more. Words have to be invited twice, I think. Once by intention, once by weather. But that night, I drew a little sequence of frames in my notebook. A woman tying twine, a man listening, a fence practicing what it means to be a bridge. Days tumbled into their cousins. The fence was no longer dull or splintered. It was a long, narrow garden party. Marigolds knelt like lanterns. Morning glories wrote blue O's on the air and erased them by supper time. The sweet peas fetched up to the trellis in their careful way and began promising perfume to anyone patient enough to be here when it happened. The chimes learned the neighborhood's language and translated every breeze. Birds ate, spilled seed, invited their friends, scolded squirrels, and then forgave them. And at odd hours, the two of us, grumpy and cordial in public, smiled privately at the common work, the way we all do for anything that breathes because we tend it. Bread dough, babies, hope. On the first morning I woke to find the tiniest sweet pea bloom, a blush pink butterfly of a flower tucked under a leaf like a secret. I almost went running to his door. Instead, I clipped it with all the ceremony of a person cutting a ribbon on a new library. I tucked it into a thimble with water and placed the thimble on the top of the fence post where our two sections met. No note. Nothing stamped or labeled. Just the smallest first bloom, held up between us like a toast. He didn't come out right away. I waited longer than was normal for an adult with actual responsibilities to wait. I almost caved and knocked. Then the back door opened. He stepped out, saw the thimble, and stopped as if someone had said his name from another decade. He lifted the thimble, weighed it in his palm like a precious coin, and nodded once, to the flower, or to me, or to his wife's window box, the bow of a man saying grace. He set the thimble back. He didn't look over. I pretended to be extremely invested in a bird whose only agenda was seed theft. But when I glanced again, the thimble had moved half an inch precisely to the center of the post. Of course it had. A line, once leaning, had found its balance, and two people had too, in a small, ridiculous way. The fence between us had accepted our apology and decided to bloom. If you'd asked me 6 months ago what would get me outside more, I might have said a dog, or a better pair of sneakers, or a podcast that made me feel like a person who composts correctly. I would not have said a fence. Fences had always been metaphors in my head. Things you got over, sat on, or politely pretended didn't apply to you. But morning by morning, this one kept handing me reasons to linger. A new curl of vine, a bead of dew fat as a jewel, the way the marigolds woke with that cheerful shock of orange as if someone had plugged them in while the world slept. I started bringing my sketchbook out with my first coffee and leaving it on the patio table until the last sparrow scolded the dusk. The fence became my favorite model, patient and uncomplaining. I drew its boards as if they were vertebrae holding up the neighborhood's back. I drew the trellis with its grid of promises, the way the sweet pea tendrils touched each rung like pianists learning where the notes were. I drew the chimes as sound instead of metal, little ribbons of line drifting from the tubes, curling around leaves, slipping through the slats like friendly eels of music. Unexpected joy is the kind you don't know how to categorize yet. It kept showing up here in shy outfits, a ladybug hitchhiking on my sleeve while I watered, the feeder hosting a shy titmouse that looked at me like a tiny librarian with a schedule to keep. The smell, good grief, the smell of the first sweet pea blossoms when they decided it was time to perfume the air. They did make the air softer, just like he'd said. Standing by the fence on those mornings, I felt like I'd been allowed into a quieter room inside the day. A few weeks into our ridiculous campaign, I noticed the lattice. It arrived as all his contributions did, at an hour and with a discretion that suggested a witness protection program for kindness. One afternoon, the corner by his shed was a plain reach of fence. The next morning it wore a new panel of fresh lattice like a tidy cardigan. The cuts were clean, the spacing exact, and the panel had been sealed already, so it gleamed faintly under the sun like a person who takes care of their skin. He had angled the lattice just so, giving the morning glories a more interesting path to pursue, and leaving my side a dapple of diamond-shaped light that hopped across the grass like fish. I ran my hand across the new wood and it hummed with the faint tack of sealer. My sketchbook caught it immediately. Diagonals and diamonds, light interrupting itself in pleasing ways, shadow making its own geometry. I tried to draw only the lattice, but the page kept filling with everything else it changed. The way the vine cast a lace of moving shadow on my sage board. The way the string lights found new places to catch. the way the marigolds glanced up, as if pleased to live near something that had obviously done the reading. The birdhouses came next, 3 of them, perched high along his side but visible through the top of the fence line like a skyline of small rooftops. One was a classic little cottage with a pitched roof and a hole that seemed to say, "Please be this size." One was round with a kind of turret, as if birds might suddenly need a castle, and one looked like a plain wooden milk carton rescued from obscurity and given a better afterlife. I had barely finished admiring them when a pair of wrens performed a loud marital argument about real estate that ended with both of them approving the milk carton. I sketched their move-in day like a wedding photographer. As for the flowers, well, I thought I knew marigolds. I did not know what marigolds become in the hands of a retired history teacher with a precise watering can and a private tenderness for anything that tries. The original 3 pots had gained cousins and then crowd. He'd eased them along the base of the fence, sinking some into the soil on my side via the now familiar contraband slide. Between them he'd tucked careful seedlings with labeled stakes. Cosmos, Nasturtium, Bachelor's Button, each name written with that tidy classroom neatness, letters marching like well-raised children. Where my style was to scatter seeds and cheer for whoever survived, his was to prune judiciously and make decisions about who got which square footage. And yet it never felt controlling. It felt like the right kind of attention, the kind that makes room. Sometimes I'd be out there sketching, and I'd find something freshly pruned, a stem shortened to let light reach the shy leaves behind it, a spent bloom pinched to encourage its sister to try. Once I discovered a bowl set on the post, half full of water with pebbles in it like a tiny landing pad. "For bees," a pencil note said, tucked under the bowl. I sat down right there on the pavers and put my forehead on my forearm and laughed because of course he had created a bee spa. The first time I heard him humming, I nearly dropped my brush. It was late afternoon, the hour when the vine shadows look like writing on the fence. I had my watercolors spread out like candies and was trying to find the exact violet of a sweet pea petal when the sound slid through the slats, low, tuneful, absent-minded. It wasn't a song so much as a lane of melody he was walking down. The chimes barely breathed. The birds, as if they'd been given instructions, kept their commentary for the other side of the yard. I sat frozen, brush dripping, afraid that any movement would make it stop. The humming wandered but didn't falter. It wasn't the melody of the radio he played low sometimes. It was older. The kind of tune you inherit by doing a task with your hands around someone who used to sing. I pictured his wife planting sweet peas, coaxing them to climb, and the sound made more sense than any explanation. My mouth filled with words I could say. I could lean toward the gap and offer some pretend question about trellis care. Some silly remark. "You've got quite a symphony going there, Arthur." I could bring him the sketch I'd just finished of a small wren with a twig and pretend I needed expert advice on whether twigs were still in use in contemporary wren architecture. But the sound felt private, the way a handwritten note does, even if it's left on a kitchen counter. I let it be. And because I am a person whose gratitude is always building pressure somewhere near the clavicle, I found another way. I wrote him a note. At my desk, I tore a clean rectangle from the heavy watercolor paper I saved for paintings that could have a future. At the top, in ink, I drew the tiny silhouettes of our chimes in a line, the tubes like exclamation marks that had learned to calm down. Below them, in my neatest print, the script I use when kids write to ask if birds can actually carry keys, I wrote, "Thank you for the lattice and the birdhouses, and for pruning. The fence keeps teaching me new shapes of light." Signed with earnestness I refuse to edit, Holly. Then, because I couldn't help myself, I sketched a marigold in the bottom corner, a small burst of orange the color of certain kinds of bravery. I folded the note once so it wouldn't catch the eye of any passing squirrel with a literacy problem, and tucked it between two boards where the slats weren't perfectly polite. Just enough of a paper edge visible in case anyone happened to be a meticulous observer of fence seams. I left it and went inside and did not loiter by the window. I am a woman of some self-control. I made dinner. I washed dishes. I pretended to watch an episode of something and instead watched my heart walk around my living room and sit down on the couch next to me and say, in a voice that sounded a lot like my mother's when she stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom with a goodnight mug of cocoa, "You're allowed to be this happy." The next morning I found his reply where my note had been, folded in half, the crease disciplined. The outside said simply, "For Miss Holly." The inside said, "The fence looks better than it ever has. Good work, neighbor." The words were simple. The ink was a shade of blue I suspected came from a fountain pen kept in a drawer with exactly two other important objects. My eyes found the period after neighbor and sat there a minute, because the period had the feeling of a handshake, that brief, firm press between palms that says we agree on the basic shape of this world. I pressed the note flat with my hand, and then pressed my mouth flat too, because I am not a person who cries easily in the morning in the yard while wearing mismatched socks. I put the note in my sketchbook like a leaf and drew it, as if making a second copy would ensure it stayed. I added a little line of chime sound ribbon across the top and a visiting wren at the corner who looked suspiciously like he was reading. The next time I saw him, in the front, of course, where our theatrical seriousness plays for the street, he was clipping his hedges in the exact way you imagine retired teachers clip hedges, as if any branch that misbehaved might be asked to attend summer school. I was hauling a bag of potting soil that was mostly air and pride. We nodded at each other as if exchanging diplomatic pouches. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I said. "Forecast says rain," he said, "which I believe is code for, I saw your note and I understood both its content and its restraint." "Plants will approve," I said, "which is code for I saw your reply, and I folded it into the part of me that holds on to useful weather." We did not talk about the fence. We did not talk about the bird houses or the bees or the humming that had passed between the boards like a gentle ghost. But that afternoon, after the forecast proved itself in a silvery rinse, I found a small parcel on my side of the fence, a bundle of bamboo stakes tied with twine, a spool of soft garden wire, and a card that read, in the same careful hand, "For the sweet pea's ambitions." I laughed alone in the rain, and then did the thing you do when a person gives you the perfect gift. They understood what you didn't know how to ask. I went outside with bare feet and mud-warm toes and built a little scaffold beside the trellis, adding 2 more rungs for the climbers. I tied new shoots to the stakes with the wire's gentle hold, whispering a thing my mother said when she buttoned my coat with hands still cold from her own gloves. "There you go, there you go." The fence grew, visibly, audibly, aromatically. The marigolds started a union and elected a particularly flamboyant bloom foreman. The cosmos threw pink like confetti across any patch of sky they could reach. The nasturtiums trailed over the edge like gossip. The morning glories continued their strict schedule, unrolling their blue veils at breakfast, tucking them back by tea. The sweet peas climbed and then decided to reconsider the concept of climbing in order to flaunt their ruffles at everyone who had been patient. The chimes found a habit. Each evening, as if presented with the day's minutes, they shook them gently into the air. Our fence of boards became a fence of hours. My sketches of it multiplied until my studio looked like it was trying to learn a new alphabet called bloom curves and breeze light. And in the slow, tidy way of living things that get noticed, something in me unclenched. Work warmed under my hands again. The publisher sent notes that said phrases like, "We adore this," and instead of dismissing them with the cynical shrug I had acquired somewhere between rent increases and deadlines, I let them light the inside of my chest like a string of our own lanterns. Meals got eaten at a table instead of above a sink. I wrote my sister back right away instead of letting texts hibernate for weeks. Sleep arrived like a small, well-trained animal. I wasn't the only one who softened. You'd have to know him to see it, really know him, the way you get to know a neighbor's routine purely by osmosis. But a few edges moved. He began to greet Mrs. Luo's dog by name and allowed it to sniff his shoelaces without looking like he was grading the dog on decorum. He started leaving his porch light on for a few minutes after the sunset went home, as if he were giving the day a chance to change its mind. Once, as he pruned the roses that run along his front walk, he wore a faded t-shirt instead of his usual neat button-down, and I tried not to think of that as a seismic event. The secret fence project became our quiet lifeline. in a world that kept handing everyone big, loud problems you were supposed to have informed opinions about by lunchtime. Here was a small, pulsing thing that needed water and noticing and the occasional retying of a wayward stem. It asked for patience more than answers. It rewarded attentiveness with fragrance and the lightest breath of bells. It felt like recovering from an illness I hadn't known I had, the kind with symptoms like forgetting how to look at things until they love you back. By unspoken agreement, we kept our correspondence sparse and deliberate. Notes appeared when a simple yes would have spilled into an essay. "The new lattice suits the vine," I wrote once. He replied, "It suits the morning." When I thanked him for the birdhouses, he wrote, "Wrens have unreasonable standards, but they can be won with dignity." When I left a sprig of sweet peas on the post with no words, I found, later that day, a thimble of rosemary on my step with a card. For courage in soups and other matters. I began sketching not just what I saw, but what I sensed. The braid of his humming with the breeze, the way the fence boards felt steadier under my palm now, as if our hands had persuaded the wood to stop leaning toward resignation and lean toward us. The invisible bridge of intention that kept building itself and then building itself again, because that is the kind of bridge you don't cross once but daily. Some afternoons, when the sun made the sage paint look almost luminous, I'd think about the first day, the loose board and the impulse that said, "Do it yourself." I'd think about my father, "Measure twice," and my mother, "There you go," and how their voices had traveled with me here like tools that don't rust. I'd think about how many quiet cities exist behind the official one we pretend to live in. This fence, this little lane of shared effort, the way a single line of ink grows into a drawing that remembers something you'd forgotten to forget. The turning point didn't arrive with a drum roll. It came folded into a normal morning, a note tucked between the slats, yes, but the note was only part of it. The air had the metallic taste it gets before rain. The chimes were thoughtful. The marigolds were busy teaching a bee the steps to a dance they rehearsed daily. I slid the paper out, for Miss Holly, and opened it like a person opening a map. The handwriting was the same careful blue. The message was only one sentence. "The fence looks better than it ever has. Good work, neighbor." But the sentence carried weight, as if each word had been balanced in a palm before it was allowed on the page. It read like a permission slip. It read like a man who once taught history deciding to admit a new fact into his curriculum, that things can improve between people whose first meeting involved leaves and grievances, that offense is not always a verdict. I read it twice. I tucked it into the sketchbook, between two drawings of the same sweet pea from differently honest angles. I stood with my hand on the sage board and counted to 8, the way I do when I want to keep from crying in places where anyone could see me, even birds. When I looked up, he was there, of course, appearing in that exact moment that proves some neighborly sixth sense is real. He had a small bag of soil and a trowel. He wore the sun hat. He glanced over, saw the paper in my hand, and did not pretend it was a flyer for gutter cleaning. "We do good work," he said, as if citing a group project completed in a reasonable time frame with an acceptable font. "We do," I said. I thought of his wife with her window box of herbs, of his careful pruning, of my sage board and my ridiculous bird feeder and the cranes folded with words on their bellies. "Thank you." He nodded, but not the curt nod of the leaf days. This one had a hinge in it, like a door that has been oiled recently. "I was wrong about the chime," he said, offhand, as if commenting on barometric pressure. "It is almost instructive." "Almost," I said, and grinned because if you give a man like him almost, he will give you the world. He looked at the morning glory, at the sweet peas, at the marigolds conferring. He put the bag of soil down and rested both hands on the fence top, a posture so companionable I had to breathe slowly to keep from ruining it by pointing it out. For a minute we stood like people who have always had a fence between them and had finally remembered that fences can be leaned on together. After he went back to his side, I sat and sketched the moment while it was still warm. Two sets of hands on the same rail, the sage board between them like a soft answer. The words, "Good work, neighbor," written in the sky where the chimes liked to draw their invisible ellipses. I didn't know exactly what we were making, beyond a better-looking fence and a more fragrant corner of the world. But I knew what it was doing to the shape of my days. The edginess that used to thrum through my mornings had thinned to a manageable thread. The evenings felt like an earned rest instead of a collapse. The house, which in the first weeks had felt like a stage set I was renting by the hour, had started to take my shape in its cushions. I stopped counting how many nights in a row I slept without waking to listen for something wrong. The listening changed into something else, tuning into the chimes, to the rustle of leaves that no longer sounded like accusations, but like a choir rehearsing quietly in another room. It softened him too, I think, though he would not thank anyone for pointing out softness as a measurable metric. I could see it in the way he sometimes lingered on his back steps at night with no project in his hands, just watching the moths conduct their moonlit errands. I could hear it in the way the radio came on a little louder than kettle level once or twice, and he didn't turn it down right away. I could feel it in the way his notes occasionally included a second sentence, extravagant, like, "The wrens have returned with last year's impatience," or "Your paper cranes hold up well and damp in case you were collecting data." The fence, in becoming beautiful, had become more than beautiful. It had learned our names. It knew where to hold our secrets and where to display our bravest small declarations. It gathered and gave back, like any good boundary between two stories that want to braid. And each day I lingered a little longer, sketched a little truer, and carried inside the house the air that had been softened by sweet peas and the punctuation of bells, as if I were allowed to import the best room of the outside to the places where I made things for children who would need stories about small repairs and the people who make them. What surprised me most wasn't the way the fence changed the view, but the way it changed the volume on my own solitude. Silence here had been a hard desk at first. Now it felt like a bed made with cool sheets. The secret work we did at the border, hammer taps, twine ties, notes tucked into seams, gave my days a backbone and my nights something like gratitude's echo. Two solitary lives, shifting closer on either side of a line, hiding and revealing in the right measures, learning to say good work, neighbor and mean. I see you tending the thing we share, and it is making us both more alive. I've always loved summer storms, at least the kind you can watch from a porch, wrapped in a blanket with a mug in your hands, safe in the knowledge that you don't have anywhere to be. The kind that sweep in with a dark belly and rattle the chimes like they're shaking coins from a jar. But this one was different. It came in mean. No gradual curtain of drizzle, no warning rumble. Just a sudden, booming slam of wind that bent the maple branches low and sent the marigolds bobbing like frantic yes men. The sky was the color of steel right before it's hammered, and the air carried that metallic tang that says, hold on to something. From my kitchen window, I watched the rain come in at a slant so hard it blurred the edges of everything, the fence, the flowers, even my own reflection in the glass. Lightning flickered, brief and surgical, and in the flash I saw the morning glories whip back on their trellis, one whole section straining away from the post. My stomach dropped. Of course the fence would be the first to go, and of course when it did, Mr. Grant would look at me with that disapproving schoolmaster face, the one that says I knew it. All our quiet progress, the notes, the marigolds, the birdhouses, it would slide right back into the territory of leaves and grievances. I tried to tell myself I should wait it out. Let the storm pass. See the damage later. But another flash lit up the yard, and this time I saw one of the pots, my favorite marigold, the freckled one, rolling away like a yellow-eyed escapee. I swore under my breath and grabbed my raincoat. By the time I made it to the back door, I saw him. Mr. Grant, in a navy raincoat that looked as if it had weathered its share of tempests, hood up, shoulders set. He was out there in the downpour, wrestling the fence post like it was a stubborn dance partner. One hand gripped the post, the other fought with a length of rope that kept slipping in the wet. Water sheeted off the brim of his hood. His back was to me, but even from here I could see the determination in the set of his shoulders. Something inside me shifted. I'd been so sure his first instinct would be to blame me, but here he was, already in the rain, doing the work. Not pointing, not lecturing, just fixing. I didn't think about it. I just pulled up my hood and stepped into the storm. The rain hit me like 1,000 cool hands pushing at once. My boots sank into the mud, making that suction sound that pulls the ground up with you when you lift your foot. I half jogged to him, leaning into the wind. He turned when I reached the sagging section. His hood shadowed most of his face, but I caught a flicker of surprise in his eyes before he simply nodded toward the post. "Hold this steady," he said over the roar of rain, and I did, planting my feet wide like a soldier bracing for impact. The post was slick under my gloves, but the moment I gripped it, something strange happened. It felt like the fence braced me back, as if all these weeks of tending and painting and note-leaving had knitted some invisible cord between us and this line of wood and wire. He looped the rope around the post, tying it off with quick, efficient movements. I'd always known him to be precise, his handwriting, his pruning, but there was something almost graceful in the way he worked here. Urgency making him decisive instead of fussy. "Next one's leaning," he called, already moving down the line. I followed, boots splashing, hair plastered to my forehead under the hood. We worked without speaking, me holding, him tying, moving like two people who'd been doing this for years instead of minutes. At one point, a gust shoved the trellis hard toward us, vines whipping, and we both lunged to catch it. My shoulder slammed into his, and for a heartbeat we were pressed together, both gripping the same slippery wood, both grinning like idiots because somehow we'd caught it. We were laughing now. Real laughing. Not the polite kind you use in grocery store aisles. It startled me as much as the storm had. The sound of it cut through the rain made the work feel almost like play. By the time we reached the last section, we were soaked straight through. Mud had claimed the lower halves of our legs. The chimes, rattled out of tune, clanged wildly above us. My hair stuck in strands across my cheeks. His hood had slipped back enough for rain to streak his silver hair flat. "Last one," he said, breathing harder now. "Good," I said, shoving the post upright with all I had left. "I'm starting to feel like one of the fence posts." He gave a short bark of laughter and tied off the rope. Then finally he stepped back, hands on hips, surveying our work. The fence still leaned in places, but it was upright, holding, surviving. We looked at each other, rain still pouring between us, and for the first time since I'd moved here, I didn't see any of the old sharpness in his eyes. Just the same relief and satisfaction I felt in my own chest. "Good work, neighbor," he said, and for once the words came with a smile that didn't feel like it had been dragged out of him. I smiled back. Likewise. We trudged back to our respective doors, dripping and grinning like kids who'd just built the world's best fort. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The rain was still coming down in a softer, steadier rhythm now, but my mind kept replaying the moment we both lunged for the trellis, the way our laughter had startled me, the quiet satisfaction of working in sync. I made tea before bed, a strong, gingery blend I'd bought on a whim but never shared with anyone. I poured it into my old thermos, the green one with a dent near the base, and carried it out to the fence. The air was cool and misty, the chimes giving the occasional tired note. I set the thermos right on top of the sage board, centered between our yards. No note, just the tea. In the morning, I padded to the back door before I even made coffee. The thermos was there, but lighter now, empty. And tucked inside, peeking out from the open lid, was a single marigold, the freckled one I'd thought the storm had claimed. Its petals were bright and defiant, a little damp but still holding their shape. I pulled it out gently, turning it in my fingers, and I smiled, because somehow without words we'd started saying everything we needed to. By late summer the fence had forgotten it was a fence. From the front sidewalk you could hear it before you saw it, the soft, chimed thrum of breeze passing through tubes, the chit-chat of wrens negotiating rent, the low hum of bees conducting their pollen errands. Then you'd turn the corner, and there it would be, a sudden vertical garden stitched between 2 yards, a seam of green and bloom. Morning glories wrote their blue O's across the day and tucked them away by dinner. Sweet peas laced the lattice with perfume so tender it felt like a hand on your shoulder. Marigolds lit the bottom border like votive candles. Birdhouses perched up top like a row of little neighbors with better hats. String lights wound around the higher rails, slept through the day and then surprised the evening like stars that had arrived early and knew it. People started slowing down when they came up the street. The stroller crowd paused to point. Look, tiny houses for tiny birds. Runners made the kind of detours that tell you they've abandoned their time goals, and the teenager on the skateboard, who had previously managed to comment without ever stopping, actually put a foot down for balance and said, "Whoa," which coming from him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Mrs. Luo declared, "It's a living fence," and the name stuck immediately, the way good nicknames do. I had thought the storm, our wild, muddy, laughing rescue, would be the turning point. And it was. But not in the grand, cinematic way stories sometimes pretend turning points work. It was more like the fence had been learning to breathe, shallow at first, then deeper, and the storm had made it inhale fully. After that, everything we'd been doing quietly began to feel like a thing we could do in daylight with our hands visible. The first morning we tended openly, we didn't plan it. I came out early to deadhead the marigolds and found him there already, in a faded t-shirt and the navy cap he wore when he meant business. He had the sharp little shears I envied and a small basket for clippings. We both stopped, the way you do when you bump into someone in a place that used to be private and suddenly belongs to both of you. "Morning?" he said, and this time it didn't sound like a password. It sounded like good news. "Morning," I answered, holding up my own less glamorous scissors. Looks like the cosmos decided to run for office. He glanced at the pink froth leaning over the rail and allowed himself a smile. On a platform of reckless optimism. We worked side by side, two people on opposite sides of the same hymn, clipping, tying, easing stems toward light. It felt exactly like it had felt in the rain, minus the wind's heckling and the mud's suction. At one point, a tangle of morning glory had made a bold attempt to seize control of both our tools at once. Our hands met over the vine, and instead of stepping back as if hands were trespass notices, we both laughed and untangled the green together. The first neighbor approached before 10. He was a mail carrier from the next block who liked our corner because it offered shade and spectacle. He leaned on his mail cart and said, "So is this a collaboration?" I glanced at Arthur, because that is who he'd become, finally, in my head and in my mouth. And he glanced at me, and a grin slid between us like a small boat that had figured out the current. "It's a silent project," I said. "Was a silent project," he corrected, flicking a clipped petal from the lattice with the kind of gentleness that made me think his students had learned more than dates from him. "Now it's just a project." "Shared custody," I said. "Joint ownership," he said. We looked at each other and dissolved into a quiet, incredulous laugh. The kind where you can feel all the earlier versions of yourselves shaking their heads in amused disbelief. The mail carrier laughed too and said, "Well, it's the best argument I've seen for property lines this week," and pushed on, whistling. Word spread, as it always does when there's something worth pointing at on daily walks. The living fence drew small crowds at unpredictable times. People brought offerings the way you bring things to babies and housewarmings. A girl of about 7 arrived with a fistful of mismatched buttons and solemnly asked if the fence liked jewelry. We threaded them on fishing line and hung them from a lower rail where they clicked together like polite applause. A retiree from around the corner brought a bird bath, with a crack you can't see if you're standing in the right place, which is my favorite kind of flaw. 2 college kids contributed a strand of origami cranes they'd folded during finals to keep their sanity. A man who mows lawns professionally donated a spool of biodegradable twine as if he were endowing a scholarship. We worried at first, quietly and separately, then openly, about this influx of attention. Would people trample the roots? Would the wrens resent being celebrities? Would the fence get loud with other people's ideas until we couldn't hear our own? But the additions came like the good kind of conversation, small, considerate, attentive to the tone already set. When someone suggested painting a mural on the slats, we said in unison and with matching winces, maybe the flowers are the mural. The suggestion maker nodded, delighted by a boundary that made artistic sense. One Saturday, Arthur hauled out an extra section of lattice, and I put up a little hand-lettered sign that said, "Add a little if you like. Please be kind to vines, bees, and wrens." Underneath, smaller, "No plastic tinsel. The chimes object." It was my voice and his standards, braided. That was the day of the public reveal I will remember when I'm old. Late afternoon, sun angled like a blessing, the fence humming with restrained delight. A small semicircle of neighbors formed, not to watch us exactly, but to witness this improbable seam doing the opposite of seams. A toddler tottered past with a watering can and poured mostly on his shoes. The teenager with the skateboard, whose name turned out to be Milo, asked if he could hang a single tiny disco ball he'd found at the thrift store. It threw dots of light into the foliage and made the bees look like sequins. The bees did not mind. When the crowd thinned, Arthur and I found ourselves facing each other across the sage board, which had weathered into its own soft legend. I rested my forearms on the top rail. He did too. The gesture was so easy now I almost didn't notice it. And then I did. And noticing felt like finishing a sentence you started in a different house. "You realize," I said, "we will never be allowed to be grumpy in public again." "We will have to take shifts," he said dryly. "I will scowl Mondays and Wednesdays. You may handle Tuesdays and Thursdays. Fridays we relent." "Saturday scowls," I mused, "for special occasions and poor sportsmanship. Sunday is for repentance," he said, and we both laughed, and I realized how close we were to leaning into the gossip of who we used to be. So I chose instead the generosity of admitting the truth. "I thought in the storm," I said, "that you'd blame me. For the fence, for the pots, for gravity." He squinted into the light, that look he gets when he is checking the past for accuracy. "I might have," he said, "last winter." "And then?" "And then someone painted a board the color my wife would have called a soft answer." He cleared his throat and set a thimble of sweet peas between us like a flag. I felt the familiar sting in my eyes that I've learned not to argue with. "You saved the trellis," I said. "You saved the whole fence." He shook his head. "We saved it. We stood with that, because some lines don't need decoration." The chimes signed their names to the moment, just a few syllables of silver. From that day on, we stopped performing indifference for the street. If we were out at the same time, we talked. If he discovered an aphid situation, he knocked on my back door with an urgency that would have made anyone think there was a movie-level crisis unfolding. and I would answer with the spray bottle like a paramedic. If I saw a wren trying to move an entire branch one twig at a time, I'd narrate with solemn professionalism while he improvised structural engineering with 2 toothpicks and a prayer. He told me stories about teaching, his first year, when he learned to pretend he had authority and discovered that kindness made better rules. He told me about his wife. Her name was Margaret, said softly, almost like a present. The window box herbs, the sweater the exact color of sage after rain, the trip they always meant to take to see the giant sequoias and never did. He did not tell these all at once. He tucked them into our tending, into the quiet hours when the light gets thin and nerves get honest. I told him about the city apartment over the laundromat and the way the dryers breathed hot insomnia through my floor. About the little book contract that had gathered dust for months until this fence taught my hand to relax. About my father's measure twice and my mother's there you go, and how sometimes my drawings feel like messages from them arriving via a slower post. I did not talk about the particular loneliness that had sent me looking for a quieter street. I didn't have to. He heard it in the way I said moved here and finally and sleep. We talked about the birds like they were colleagues we admired. We traded recipes for supporting actors, soups for tired weeks, tea for chagrin, lemonade for afternoons that do not want to end. He started showing up with his own thermos sometimes, and we instituted a custom. If one of us found a marigold more perfect than its siblings, more freckled, more fervent, we tucked it into the other's thermos lid and returned it like a small, ridiculous trophy. By the time the string lights started their nightly glow without our reminding them, the living fence had sprawled into a little commons. People began asking if they could add something in memory of someone. A woman tucked a sprig of lavender tied with blue ribbon into an empty slat for a mother who loved Provence and porch swings. A boy fastened a metal charm shaped like a treble clef where the chimes would brush it, for a grandfather who whistled his way through grief. We watched these additions gather like quiet liturgy, and we understood in a new way how a boundary can become a place to put your tenderness when you are not sure where else it belongs. One evening, Milo, the skateboarder, who had revealed himself to be a sculptor of small and improbable objects, arrived with a handful of bent spoons and a plan. "Mobile?" he asked, eyes bright. I looked at Arthur, who was already calculating wind patterns and relative weights. The three of us built it together. A spoon and button constellation that turned very slowly in the slightest breeze, marking time with glints. We hung it at the end of the fence where the sunset would find it, and let it discover its own choreography. It clicked softly like a polite clock, and Arthur, who pretends not to enjoy anything that looks whimsical, stood under it longer than necessary. It wasn't just the fence that changed shape in public. Inside the houses that edged it, the rooms adjusted a little too. the way furniture shifts after you roll up a rug. I started leaving my back door open in the evening to let in the respectable insects and the scent of sweet peas. My drawings moved from birds with keys to a girl who makes a shared garden with a difficult neighbor, and the editor wrote back yes in the subject line, and then in the body, something measured and businesslike that still felt like dancing. Arthur began to sit on his back steps after dinner with a book, and sometimes the book stayed closed in his lap while he watched the porch moths patrol the light as if he'd been assigned the best homework. One Saturday, a handful of us, neighbors who had planted ourselves here by accident and choice, made a plan, a living fence evening. Nothing official, no flyers, just word that there would be lemonade, and if someone accidentally brought cookies, it would be rude not to eat them. Arthur, having once declared sugar the devil's glitter, accepted a lemon square with the solemnity of a priest accepting an offering and ate it without comment. We all pretended not to notice his pleasure. It is impolite to shout gotcha at growth. We strung an extra loop of lights high where the birds wouldn't tangle themselves. Mrs. Luo brought her dog, who wore a bandana printed with tiny daisies and behaved admirably. A violinist from 3 houses up tucked herself near the fence and spun out a tune so gentle the chimes agreed to accompany without upstaging. A little boy stood in front of the Wren's house, rapt, as if he had discovered television in an era before television shouted. I watched the faces tilted up toward the vines and the light and thought, this is what it looks like when a neighborhood remembers it is a verb. Around the middle of that evening, as light tilted from gold to honey to something even softer, Arthur and I ended up at the fence together again, because eventually all our talking and all our silence leads us there. He touched the sage board, our beginning, and then unexpectedly put his hand over mine where it lay on the rail. It wasn't the kind of gesture that announces itself. It just arrived, fit perfectly, and rested there like a truth we'd been practicing. Thank you, he said, voice low enough that only the nearest leaf could have overheard. For this. I looked at the board, at the vines, at the tiny disco ball throwing small moons into the foliage, at the button mobile turning on its slow axis, at the faces that were no longer strangers because we had all watched something live together. I thought of the storm and the mud and the thermos with the marigold tucked inside. I thought of the first morning I met him, the leaves and the lecture and how my hands had shaken in that ridiculous way anger makes them shake. You're welcome, I said, for this, and thank you for letting the fence be more than a fence. He nodded once. His eyes were bright in a way that made me see the younger man and the boy before him, the one who learned early how to keep his pencils sharp and his feelings in the middles of lines. It needed 2 people, he said. At least 2. I could have said more, about shared work and soft answers, and how sometimes you fix the thing between you to fix the thing inside you. But the chimes, as if sensing we were at risk of explaining the magic out of the magic, made a gentle, decisive sound, and we both laughed again. When the neighbors drifted home and the last glass found its way to the correct porch, the living fence settled into its nighttime persona. The birds went quiet. The string lights starred themselves against the coming dark. The perfume of late sweet peas, deepened by the day's heat, folded itself into the air like the last paragraph of a letter. We didn't say good night. We did the thing we do instead. I went to my kitchen and filled the kettle. He went to his. We returned with our mismatched mugs and sat on our respective sides, turned slightly toward each other like two bookends holding up a story. The fence glowed between us, not as a barrier, not even as a bridge anymore, but as an organ, something that breathed for both yards at once. We sipped. The tea tasted like ginger and forgiveness. Fireflies made half-hearted punctuation in the grass. The button mobile ticked faintly as it turned. The tiny disco ball tossed constellations onto the leaves. Somewhere a night bird cleared its throat and decided against a speech. "You know," I said, "we could write up what we did. Not instructions, more like a field guide to being almost grumpy until you remember you like people." "I could contribute a glossary," he said. "Terms such as apical dominance and magnanimity and don't panic." "And a recipe section," I said, "for tea that makes you call your sister back." "And a single paragraph," he added, "on the moral hazards of wind chimes." I laughed. "You've come around." "I have," he said, and his voice had that soft gravel it gets when he's telling the truth without clearing his throat first. "They say something honest about the weather." We drank in companionable silence. The night carried on, doing what nights do. I felt something like a closing chapter gather in my chest. Not an ending exactly, but the moment a story knows it has balanced its ledger. The fence we fixed, and then finished fixing us. The line we tended until it started tending back. When I finally stood, I set my mug on the top rail for a second and laid my palm on the sage board the way I had that first night, the hello that began all this. Across from me he did the same, palm to paint, hello again. We held that for a beat, then another, two people acknowledging a place the world had widened around us because we had said yes to it in small ways. "Good night, Holly," he said. "Good night, Arthur." I went inside to a house that was no longer a stage set, to a desk where pages waited that did not frighten me. Behind me, through the screen, the living fence glowed steadily and breathed its quiet breath. I knew, without seeing it, that he sat for a few minutes more on his steps, finishing his tea, the chimes signing off for the day with their three-syllable signature. In the morning, the birds would rehearse. The bees would clock in. The neighbors would slow down and touch the marigolds the way people pet dogs because dogs know about joy. We would meet at the rail with our shears and our twine and our stoic humor and continue the work of tending the line that had become our common garden. But for now, the boundary between us had bloomed into peace. The fence was no longer a wall. It was a shared sentence, softened to an answer. And we, on our respective sides, sat and sipped and listened, connected by the garden we grew together, while the string lights caught the night and held it gently, one small warm bulb at a time. And that ends tonight's meditation. You're welcome to stay for a bit longer if you like. Have a beautiful night. Until next time.